Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
You're listening to The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak, connecting the reality of the gospel to the grit of life. You can support the podcast and pick up some sweet Flipside swag at www.patreon.com/Noah Filipiak.
What is up, Flippopotomi, and welcome to episode 79 of the Flipside podcast. We are back from sabbatical, and I want to just briefly go over a couple things that I discerned during that sabbatical time, and maybe some goals to have for us as a podcast listener community, as I want this podcast to get better and better, and I want it to be sustainable for me as well. And so, first thing is, if you missed it, there is a podcast survey that I created, and I would love for you to fill that out. A relatively small number of people have filled it out so far, but I'm deeply grateful to those of you that have. And please know that your comments and the things that you submit on the survey are really helping me shape the flip side to make it better. So thank you. If you have not had a chance to fill out the survey, you can go to noahfilipiak.com/survey, and you will find the podcast survey. I do want to read one of the comments from the survey. It says, really appreciate the flip side, the humor, the deep talks and topics, the realness of it. It's really helped me become less and less tribal in my beliefs and positioning towards them. I think God's really used it to convict me of this specifically. Thank you for doing the podcast. I love that. Now, certainly, some of the feedback on the podcast, on the survey is more constructive in nature, but to hear that kind of encouragement is really helpful to me, and whoever wrote that, this is all anonymous, but to hear that God is using the podcast to help you be less tribal in your beliefs, that's huge. That's a huge encouragement to me, and I love it. I need that encouragement. So I would love others to take a few minutes to fill out the survey. Again, that's noahfilipiak.com/survey. A couple things. One change I'm planning on making is we're not going to do Noah's Rant as a part of the long-form Flipside episodes. So some people like Noah's Rant, some people don't. It is weird. It's a weird transition even for me, and it takes a lot of energy. And so instead of adding it at the end of a normal episode like this, episode 79, Noah's Rants will be put out as their own episodes, kind of a bonus episode material that you can skip if you don't want to listen to it. And I think that'll help for a number of reasons. And another thing that I want to, one of the questions at the end was, if you're not already a Patreon subscriber, would you become one if it would help keep the flip side on the air? And about half of those that filled out the survey said yes. Again, small sample size. And so I want to talk a little bit about that before we get into our interview with Greg Coles. And just say, I want to set a goal that right now we're at 12 patrons, and I'd like us to get up to 20 to really make the podcast sustainable. And what do I mean by that? One of my big takeaways, so I'm planting a church. I do nonprofit work with an organization we started called New Humanity, which is one of my funding sources for my church plant, multi-ethnic church planting, urban community development network. Also do Beyond the Battle, my book, and then the groups that we run out of Beyond the Battle, my alumni group. So I have a lot going on. In fact, I have too much going on, straight up. And I'm still discerning if I can keep doing the podcast. If anything were to go, it would probably be the first thing to go, just because of the responsibility of leading those other organizations. And so I'm hiring a producer, and I'm hiring a scheduling manager. These are people that I know, people that I trust, and I need more patrons on Patreon to be able to pay them. And so what that will mean is hopefully my responsibility will simply be just doing the recording of the episode and a few emails here and there, and their responsibility will be doing the producing, the editing, the social media of it, as well as helping me with some scheduling and your Patreon swag if you choose to become a Patreon supporter. So the only way to make the podcast sustainable is for me to do that, for me to do less of those portions of doing the podcast, to hire others to do it. And I think that will really take the flip side as a whole up, another level. So yeah, straight up. I don't want it to be like an ultimatum. It's not that. I just want to be realistic that, as I was talking as well, I was talking to a buddy of mine during the sabbatical period, and you can pray for me. I don't know if asking my podcast listeners to pray for me as I discern, should I get rid of the podcast? But I need it. I do need the prayer. I want to live with boundaries and margin. And so right now it's an experiment to say, okay, could I live with boundaries and margin by raising up some leaders here as well as in those other responsibilities that I'm looking at, getting others to do more so that I can do less, but keeping the podcast going. So the only way that will happen is to give this a try. So to give it a try, we're at 12 now. There's different tiers of giving. You can give as low as $3 a month or as much as you want. Some give $50 a month, and just to give you kind of a ballpark range. But go to patreon.com/Noah Filipiak, and I'm just trying to break even really at this point. But then above and beyond that, I was talking to a good friend during the sabbatical. We were praying for each other and just what I'm discerning. And I said, if I made more on the podcast, the goal is that I can be part-time at my church, which I already am, so that we can free up some of our church money, church dollars to hire other part-time staff, not have my salary be the burden on a young urban church plant's budget. But the podcast would be easier to do if it felt more like a real job. And the podcast is fun, but also it's, you go to your job because you're getting paid, and there's people expecting you to do certain things, and we want to have a certain level of professionalism that I want to get better at. But honestly, I need to get paid more from this for it to be a legitimate, actual part-time job that allows me to be part-time at the church. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense, to put the time and energy into it. So 20 Patreons, 20 patrons is the goal to just cover the expenses of hiring a producer and a scheduling manager and some of the other overhead that I have. And then above and beyond that is the goal, right? That's the goal, to make this a legitimate, job that I'm going to keep doing consistently for a very long time, and that would allow me to stay in that part-time capacity, pay-wise. Certainly, the workload of church planting is what it is, but I'd love to be able to stay in that about 3/4 time pay at my church. So you can go to patreon.com/Noah Filipiak to become a patron. We're going to try to get to 20 to make the podcast sustainable. So going to jump into the interviewing Greg Coles today, and we have a very robust conversation about sex, about sexuality, and Greg he's brilliant. He is a really deep thinker when it comes to sex. He is a gay, celibate, single Christian. So put all those things together. He wrote a book called Single Gay Christian, which I'll read here in a moment in his bio. And but he works at the Center for Faith, Gender, and Sexuality. I've interviewed Preston Sprinkle on the podcast a couple times. Preston is the director there, and some of you might be familiar. But this is not something that Greg woke up this morning and decided to talk about. He's lived this out. He's had to live through the tension theologically of, the way Greg reads the Bible, the way I read the Bible, says sex is meant for marriage between a man and a woman. And yet Greg, at a young age, discovered that he was attracted to men. And Single Gay Christian is a wonderful book. I really, really encourage you to read it, to give you empathy for people that are gay and that are wrestling with the kind of stuff Greg has had to wrestle with. And as I mentioned in the interview, it's also a really good book on discipleship. What does it mean to pick up your cross and follow Jesus? And for me, as a married guy, Beyond the Battle, just all my own issues within marriage. Man, reading his book was like, yo, if this guy can pick up his cross and follow Jesus and sacrifice so much for Jesus and for his walk, and to find Jesus in that. It's not just a sacrifice. It's then finding. I pray it and describe it as we have these cracks and holes inside of us, and that the love of Jesus would fill those holes that we're looking to be filled from humans. And just a beautiful story, but just know that it's never easy. It's never clean. You read about it in the books, and it's real life. It's like real life, just like it is for all of us. And so just kind of buckle up for this. Greg has we have a lot of fun in the interview, but we talk deeply, and it is meant to get you to think deeply. And this is a topic I would also encourage you. I've talked quite a bit about human sexuality on the flip side in the past. Most recently, I interviewed Pastor Jack Seitzema in episode 67. And then in episode 69, I interviewed he and his wife, Becky, about their mixed orientation marriage. If you don't listen to anything else, I would highly encourage you to listen to episode 67, where Pastor Jack gives his testimony and he gives a sermon at his church that I include inside of that episode. And frankly, it's just the best talk I've ever heard on the topic of human sexuality from a gay / same-sex attracted pastor, and really sharing publicly with his congregation for the first time, and just really, really, really powerful. We've also interviewed previously on the podcast Nate Collins, Wesley Hill, Lori Krieg, and would encourage you to check those episodes out as well. For me as a pastor, we're just starting a series called God and Sex at my church, and if you haven't been aware, this topic is tearing apart churches. It's tearing apart denominations. And in that episode 67, I hope you listen to my words in there. I just want my listeners to know, some who attend my church, I have a lot of respect, and I know Greg does too, for those of you that are open and affirming in your theology. So open and affirming would mean that your biblical interpretation of the overall interpretation of Scripture would be that gay marriage is okay, and that same-sex sexual relationships, usually within marriage, are okay. Would be that view, and you're not going to hear from me something like, get out of here, that sort of thing. I understand your view, I really do, and in this sermon series at my church, I'm hoping to do the impossible, which is something I think Jesus did, where he was able to name truths that Greg and I believe are true about Scripture, that you'll see, here in this interview, but in a way that, I wish there were gay people in the New Testament. I wish that they were named. I'm sure they were there. I wish we could have seen Jesus's interaction with them, but you do see case study after case study of people that the church had rejected, case study after case study of people that were outcasts in society, that just were drawn to Jesus. They were just simply drawn to Jesus, and I firmly believe that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, everyone. People would be drawn to Jesus today if he were walking around today. And we in churches like mine really need to figure out how, and again, that would be people like Greg who are saying I'm gay and I'm celibate and single, as well as others who aren't, who are in relationships, romantic relationships, or sexual relationships with the same sex. And Greg makes some great points, essentially, within the heterosexual realm. We make all kinds of exceptions to that rule. And I don't think we say that specifically, but it's something I'll say here. You think about it in the church, how many exceptions to the biblical norm of, okay, marriage, sex is within marriage between a man and a woman. We allow all types of people heterosexually that are breaking that into our church, and we would say, we want you here. The church is for you. Jesus is for you. And there's just a lot of double standards that we have when it comes to the way we address LGBTQ plus sexuality, and we get into some of those double standards here in this interview. And so these interviews are meant to stretch you. If you want to interact more, you're always welcome to email the podcast. The email address is podcast@beyondthebattle.net. I want to give a quick shout out to Angry Brew for sponsoring the show. Thank you. I have got my Angry Brew today in my awesome Flipside mug. By the way, you can get your own. My third favorite podcast is the Flipside mug, or our other incredible swag if you become a Patreon subscriber. But go to angrybrew.com, 5lakes.com, pick up some Angry Brew or some Chris's Blend. Use the promo code FLIP, and you will get 10% off your order. Super thankful for the folks over at Angry Brew for sponsoring the show. So let's jump into the interview with Greg, and then we'll wrap up that interview with a little conclusion. And again, there won't be a Noah's Rant at the end of this episode. And the goal for the Flip Side going forward is to do about 2 episodes a month, and then another 1 or 2 Noah's Rants on top of that. You can head over to YouTube if you'd like to watch the show instead of listen. You can watch at youtube.com/Noah Filipiak, and do subscribe to the audio feed to get your 5-minute flips. All right, let's jump into the interview with Greg. Hey, let's not jump in the interview with Greg. I should read his bio first. I'm a little rusty. I made a few jokes about that as I was talking with Greg. Let me read Greg's bio, and then we'll jump into the interview with Greg. Gregory Coles is the author of Single Gay Christian, InterVarsity Press, and No Longer Strangers from InterVarsity Press. He holds a PhD in English from Penn State and lives in Idaho's Treasure Valley, where he works as a writer and speaker. Greg is a senior research fellow at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and curates most of his creative activities at GregoryColes.com. So let me correct myself. Let's jump into this interview with Dr. Gregory Coles. Here we go.
You ever heard the sound of freedom? Freedom, freedom, freedom. Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
All right, Greg, thanks so much for joining us on the Flip Side.
Oh, what a joy. Thanks for having me, Noah.
Hey, right. So, Greg, you and I got to meet in Boise, Idaho, a couple months ago. I think it was a couple of months ago.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Pretty awesome. And the rumor on the street in Boise was that you are not very good at the app Hurdle. The music guessing. I've never played Hurdle, but it's like Wordle, but you guess music.
Yeah.
Due to your missionary child upbringing, that you kind of missed out on decades of secular music. Is this true? Can you confirm this for the Flip Eponymai audience here?
I mean, here's what I'd like to say in my own defense. Well, yes, number one, I did grow up in Indonesia, and so that deprived me of, some time of music. And also, most of the people that I play Hurdle with were born approximately 9 years before I was. So, I'm not sure that I would be at their level, even if I had grown up in the States. Also, I feel like growing up in Indonesia is a handy excuse for just generally having very little pop culture knowledge. And it's quite possible that I still would have been a child with very little pop culture knowledge, but Indonesia is definitely my excuse.
Well, I did not grow up in Indonesia, but I did grow up Baptist. And there's some similarities, I think, to why I also would be bad at Hurdle. So our mutual friends, Josh and Grace, who I stayed with when I was in Boise, were playing
delightful.
Hurdle. And this is where they let the cat out of the bag. That because I said to him, if that was like 1990s CCM Hurdle, I'd probably be pretty good at it. Like if they were throwing out Caedmon's Call and Third Day songs, I think I would be really good. And they said, you and I have similar, skills in that
Yeah,
area. So
that feels correct. And it should be noted too that though Noah and I only met each other a couple months ago at this conference, because of our mutual friendship, I've already heard tales of Noah for a long time. So I feel like we went
Awesome.
into our knowing
Yeah.
one another with a sense that this would work out well.
Yes, I love how God does things that way. So, and your Center for Faith group, we'll talk about that. But your crew, your posse, we've had several of them on here as well, and I feel like you all are delightful, and it's like just having another member of the family on. So that's also pretty awesome.
I mean, I'm glad to catch up with this family reunion in that case.
Yeah. And so I read both of your books. And I should confess, I was thinking about this. I say I read them. I listened to them on audiobook. So I don't know if that counts. I hope it does, but I feel like the Holy Spirit's convicting me that I have to, when I say I read them, it's like kind of, I listened to what you wrote, and I really like them both.
Well, that's so fun. It's especially fun in the case of the second one, because I got to read that audiobook.
Yes.
So
yes. Yeah, I don't remember the voice on the first one. I won't I don't want you to throw that person under the bus whether you liked it or not. But I know sometimes it's strange to listen to, a book someone wrote and be like, that doesn't sound like them at all, or whatever. So
I'll tell you two stories. Well, one story about that, though I will say, I thought he did a lovely job. I've never met the man, but I listened to a bit of it and I was like, oh, that's nice. There was a sentence that I heard him read and leave out the word not. And I was like, oh, that's the exact opposite of what I meant, because he didn't read the word not. But other than that, I did get an email once from a reader and they were like, I want you to know, I just finished listening to the audiobook for your first book. It was a really good book, but I could not stand that reader's voice. He sounded like such a snob. So I never thought he was a snob, but apparently some people thought he was a snob. Then again, some people think I'm a snob. So maybe that was really like a well-paired reader.
I can't imagine anyone thinking you're a snob. I would beg to differ with that.
Well, that's kind of you.
They have
Hopefully
not
by the end of this conversation, you'll still carry that sentiment with you.
They have not met you in person. You do not have any snobbiness about you. So I will testify on that behalf. It's always strange in a podcast to be like, hey, start out with your life story. But can you, for us, a little bit, like sum it up? Kind of, you talk about that a lot in Single Gay Christian, and you get into it even more, kind of some of the dynamics and the layers of the alienation you've experienced in No Longer Strangers. So for listeners who haven't read, either book, can you kind of give a synopsis of that, some of your upbringing in Indonesia, and just, in a sense, can you summarize both books and your life story in about, maybe 30 seconds or so? No, I'm totally kidding.
Yeah.
But
I am ready. Put me in.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you sort of a broad structure into which, and then I'll explain briefly how sort of both books fit into that structure. So I was born in very upstate New York, think basically Canada, up that part of New York. Lived there for 3 years, and then my family moved to Indonesia. And I grew up in Indonesia for 15 years, came back to the States for college. My parents continued to be in Indonesia a while longer. College, I went to a Christian liberal arts college in Western New York for undergrad. And then I worked for a church for 1 year. Oh my gosh, you guys have mugs. That's so exciting.
Can you read it?
The Flip Side mugs. My third favorite podcast.
Yeah.
This begs the question, what are your first two favorite podcasts?
I don't know. I just know that mine isn't good enough to be the first for anybody. So it's just kind of like my running joke. So
so you can give the merch to people and be like, I might have made third spot for you.
We have low standards. If I shoot for third, I don't have to be that good, so just like good enough. So that's kind of the goal.
I strongly respect that energy. Well, and maybe you'd be better if you had guests that didn't interrupt themselves during their storytelling to talk about your mugs.
You fit right in around here. I might just make you a co-host. It'll be great.
I'm trying to read the energy of the podcast here and respond accordingly.
This is the energy for sure.
Where were we? Oh, I was moving back to America. No, I had gone to college. That's where we were.
Yep.
Studied communication. minored in music and literature, and then I started working for a church for 1 year. And I actually thought I was going to work at the church for a long time. Like I was like, I think I'll be a pastor. That's probably the career trajectory. There were a number of reasons that the Lord moved differently, and I decided that was a great short-term place to be and not the right place to be forever. But after a year there, I started grad school, went to Penn State, studied English, got my master's and PhD there. And then I worked for a church for a couple more years as a worship leader, and freelanced a bunch of my time writing and editing and speaking. And then 2 years ago now, in 2021, I moved out to Boise, Idaho, where I work part-time with the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, as we previously discussed. And spend the rest of my time still kind of freelancing in various ways. Within that broad frame of my life, so when I was between my master's and my PhD in grad school, I had this summer where I was like, I'm going to write a novel. And I had terrible writer's block that summer. So instead of writing the novel, I took my agent's advice and just sat down in front of a blank Word document and wrote whatever came out of me. And whatever came out of me was a book reflecting on my my experience of sexuality over the years. So the quick spoiler there is I'm gay and celibate, which is sort of an awkward thing to be in a world that, you know, often feels kind of awkward about gay people, and certainly feels kind of awkward about celibate people. And, you know, nobody's quite sure what to do with you. So yeah, I wrote this book very accidentally, just kind of reflecting on my own experience. That book came out while I was in grad school, and became, you know, the source of some of my opportunities to go around and chat with people and the like. And then my second book, No Longer Strangers, gets to kind of start earlier in the story, reflect more on life in Indonesia and sort of the weirdness of growing up as a really highly privileged racial minority, which is different than the way we think about racial minority experience in the US, where we think, you know, the people with privilege are always the people in the majority. In Indonesia, it's very much the reverse. And so, you know, I had kind of a fraught sense of like where I did and did not belong growing up. So No Longer Strangers is, you know, a book reflecting on that experience of like belonging in physical spaces. Also the experience of belonging or not belonging in terms of community experience as somebody who, again, is gay and celibate, and, you know, the white evangelical world feels pretty weird about that. But just reflecting on what it means as a follower of Jesus to find ourselves seeking belonging in a world where we don't really ultimately belong.
Thank you. That's great. This is long before I met you. You know, when I listened to Single Gay Christian, and it was a couple years ago, and I remember listening to it, feeling just really inspired by your story, a story of someone who's picking up their cross and following Jesus. And I want to say this for listeners. You know, a listener might say, well, why would I read that book if I'm not gay, you know, or whatever. That book for me was so helpful as far as just a book on discipleship goes, like my own personal discipleship. And I do a lot of work, a lot of ministry with guys, particularly around the topic of sex, because of my book Beyond the Battle. And, you know, we definitely have had a handful of gay guys come through our groups. We do these like 7-week groups online. And we have an ongoing alumni community. And my point to this is, these guys are in a lot of different places. Some are single, some are divorced, some are married like myself. And there's this, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word. There's this myth, I guess, in the church that marriage will solve all your problems, sex will solve all your problems. And this guys get married and they're like, oh, marriage and sex did not solve all my problems. Or you know, they're having sex, you know, before marriage. It's like sex isn't solving all my problems. And I don't know, I think sometimes it can be just your story. It was so inspiring to me in my own marriage to be like, man, if like Greg can pick up his cross and follow Jesus with joy, and certainly with struggle and pain, but with joy, and can truly model, like that is modeling what discipleship is, then I can do it within my own marriage. Like I don't want to my wife would not enjoy me getting into all of those issues here on this podcast. But there's plenty of times when it's like, oh, woe is me, and I get all this entitlement, and I have a whole chapter that my book starts out talking about entitlement that we take into our marriages. So anyway, it's a long way of saying I'm really inspired by you and your Christian walk, and for others who are walking a similar path as you. So I just want to say thank you. And for listeners, if you're any of my Beyond the Battle listeners, you should read Greg's book, because you will be inspired by it. And whatever your situation is, you're going to say, man, if this guy can follow Jesus like that, so can I. So I just want to say thank you. Big encouragement.
Oh, shucks. What an honor. Thanks, Noah.
Yeah. And on that same line, I got to say the flip side of that coin, I get really frustrated when I hear conservative Christians who have like a problem with you, or have a problem with, Wes Hill or Nate Collins or Lori Krieg or whoever, like people that are gay, that have like, hey, I'm gay, and but I'm going to, I believe in the Bible's view of sex and marriage between a man and a woman. And I think what you're doing is so difficult. I think it is harder than anything I have to do. And to me, you are one of my faith heroes to say, Jesus, is that worth it to you? And the church, not all, but some, and I know you have to deal with this. The church that somehow like lessens you because you have attraction to the same sex that you don't control. And we'll get into some of that potentially in this podcast. I don't want you to have to rehash all that. But how do you, I don't even know what I'm asking you. I just want you to know it's frustrating to me when I hear that. And I think those people are really wrong. And they're, I don't know. It's like Paul sacrifices all this stuff for Jesus. And it'd be like people just saying, oh no, he's not, we're not following. Like he's not worth being an example of Christ because of some, I don't know. It's just, so let me try to wrap that into a question. Like, tell us a little bit about that. Just tell us about what that's like for the church to, you've hinted at it, some of the alienation and things like that. The church doesn't know what to do with a gay Christian, though you're like, yo, I'm celibate. Yo, I'm actually submitting to exactly what you believe. And I'm actually taking a harder path, a more difficult path than you are. How have you experienced that from the church, and how do you process all that?
Yeah. I think, well, there are a number of factors that can play into the challenge of that, or even the discomfort or tension that I think people feel. And I don't want to diminish the reasons that people might feel to have concern with a story like mine, right? Like I think there are lots of reasons that people might understandably feel cautious of me. Now, having said that, I would love for them to feel less cautious of me. But one of the dynamics is just the linguistic dynamic that, people have all kinds of strong feelings about what language one should use to describe oneself when one turns out to have an experience of being attracted to the same sex and seeking to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I mean, I love when people think that language is important because, I got a PhD in English.
Right.
So I'm like really here for the language being important notion. Yeah. I'm all about it. And yet I think a thing that often happens in language is we decide how we understand certain words. We decide the ways that we would like to use language. And then we try to interact with the rest of the world as if the only function that any word has in the world is the function that we have given to it. We tend as human beings to have an incredibly narcissistic understanding of language that's very much rooted in just our own experience. Mm-hmm. I think that the challenge that arises then is lots of folks within, at least within evangelical Christianity, have a pretty negative view of the word gay.
Yeah.
And assign a lot of baggage to that word, even though the baggage they assign to it isn't inherently connected to the word, and certainly not connected to the way the word gets used in the world more broadly. So when I came out, I was in grad school, humanities program at a state school, and the word gay to most of the people I was in grad school with just meant like someone who is, persistently attracted to the same sex. It didn't necessarily mean some of the things that evangelicals would assume that it meant. So that's one sort of dispute, is like the language dispute. Like, is this the right language to use? There can also be concerns about the question of whether the state of being attracted to the same sex is itself like a morally culpable sin. And here we have kind of two layers. There's some folks, some Reformed theologies that would say any experience of sexual attraction to somebody that you're not married to should be understood as a morally culpable sin. And that particular understanding of Reformed hamartiology, which I recognize is not everyone's understanding, I find it hard to line that up with the scripture saying that Jesus was tempted in every way just as we are and yet without sin. It seems like if you're going to say that there are certain kinds of temptation that are inherently sinful, then you're saying, well, Jesus, he was tempted sort of like we are, but not exactly like we are, and not in every way, just in some ways. I don't know that I find it a terribly compelling argument. But there are also, I think, folks who would want to say, oh, no, the experience of being straight, those sorts of sexual attractions, that kind of experience of sexual temptation is not itself sinful in the same way as being gay. There's sort of a separate category for people who are gay. And some people will try to defend that view using Romans 1 to say like, Romans 1 explains to us just how bad an experience of same-sex lust is. It seems to me, if anyone succeeds in reading Romans 1 and concluding that some other people who are not you are worse sinners than you, then maybe you should really skip ahead to Romans chapter 2, verse 1, because it has a few things to say on the subject. You then have no excuse, you who cast judgment on someone else, because at whatever point you condemn someone else, you yourself stand condemned, because you who judge do the very same things. Amen. Pass the communion wafers. So anyway, so there are lots of things that people could feel leery about when it comes to me. But to get to maybe what's the more to me the most interesting part of the experience of being someone who has other Christians look at them sometimes and is like, yeah, I don't know about you, Coles, you seem sketchy. It really forces me, and I think for a lot of folks I know who are in a similar position, in a similar vocation, it forces us to really reckon with the difference between following Jesus for the sake of following Jesus and following Jesus for the sake of being perceived as following Jesus.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think for so many Christians, including myself at many stages of my life, it becomes really easy to confuse those two things, to think, oh, to the degree that I'm actually following Jesus effectively, I will also be perceived by the Christians around me as someone who is following Jesus effectively. And because of that, our motivations can get really tangled up. And so I'm just following Jesus for his own sake because I care so much becomes almost indistinguishable from I'm following Jesus because I've gotten really fond of the experience of having the people around me look at me and say, yes, Coles, you're doing it well. And I think it is a gift to begin to disentangle those things and to actually ask ourselves, which matters more to me, the perceptions of the people around me, or the actual gift of who Jesus is, even if following him turns out to be precisely the thing that causes me to be seen as a bit of a what's a good word for it? As a bit sketchy. We'll settle with that, shall we? Yeah, if following Jesus turns out to be the thing that makes me appear to some people that I am outside of the bounds of their vision of proper Christendom, is it still worth it in those moments? And that, I think, whether or not we answer the question effectively, it seems to me that even being put in a position of asking the question can be a real gift to our walk with Jesus.
Man, that's good. Yeah. And you, oh my goodness. Yeah. I thank God for Jesus that, like, he's our ultimate, like, just
Amen to that.
Right. I just honestly, because it's easy, and we in different ways, but it's easy in the church to but there's comfort in knowing that truly God is our judge, and that, like, we have scripture and we have the Holy Spirit. And so, yeah, you brought up a couple big topics that are great. And sometimes I'm like, I don't want to make you rehash the SSA versus gay, and rehash but it is tough because, right. And I'm trying to gauge myself, like, how much. Let me say a couple things as host of this podcast and as a pastor and some people in my church listening, from my perspective. And I've said these things before on here, and then feel free to let me know if you're tracking with me or not. So, one, I think there's, I won't name names, but there's blogs. There's maybe a blog in particular that a lot of people read, and they'll write articles, and they'll say things like, "This is why you must use same-sex attraction and not gay. And if you use gay, you're in sin," or something. And then people read that and they're like, "Oh, God just wrote this blog and Greg Coles is a sinner." Right? Okay. So that bothers me. And it bothers me, like, the way we perceive some of these blogs, like, as if these people writing these are, like, we just put too much authority in some of this. I know individual friends, people in my church and outside that use same-sex attracted to describe themselves, and I think they have great reasons for it. And I have friends that use gay to describe themselves and have great reasons for it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what Christians need to understand, and they often don't, is, like you were alluding to it. Some Christians hear gay and they think it means you're accepting the sin the Bible talks about of sex, of gay sex, and that's a sin. And so if you take that word on to describe yourself, no, I've heard people say so many times, "Well, I don't identify myself as a prideful Christian or a whatever, fill in a greedy Christian. I'm just a Christian. My identity's in." And I think what they're really missing, and I don't remember exactly from your story, what age you were when you discovered you had same-sex attraction. But I was just talking to a friend recently. He was 7 years old, and he's 7 years old. He likes boys. And he also talks about liking things. And this isn't true of everybody's story, but for him, he's like, I liked things that boys didn't like. Like, the hobbies that I liked weren't the hobbies that other boys liked. And I wanted to have the hobbies other boys liked, and I just didn't have them. I had these, he listed out some other hobbies. And you look at a 7-year-old, that's like, has attraction to boys and who's having these other hobbies, and you go, how there's something about being gay that has nothing to do with sex. It has to do, and again, this is where I kind of falter. I don't have all the right words, and I don't want to say the wrong thing, but you could probably help us out there. But I think that's really what's needed. And I had a question I'm going to ask you in a minute. We'll table it for now. I'm doing a sermon series right now on sex. So we just started it on Sunday, and just did the kickoff on Sunday, and then we're going to do it for the next few weeks. And I asked my friend, I was like, what would you want to hear? What would you want to hear in that sermon? And he said, you need to tell, like, these Christians that, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, being gay is about a lot more than sex. Like, sex is a very small part of it. And I was just talking to somebody yesterday because I kicked the series off. So we've just like kicked all the dust up in the air. And I thought, man, and you can imagine it, you've lived it, but I was talking to this fellow straight person and I said, can you imagine you're a child and you discover like you're attracted to the opposite sex, and all you hear in the church is, if you're gay, you're a sinner, some would say you're going to hell. All these, I've heard the stories of the parents who are like, if my child were gay, I'm going to disown them, these Christian parents. And it's literally something you didn't have a choice in and don't have control over. And you're going to church and you're going, what? And then we wonder why the suicide rate is so high and why the exodus from the church is so massive. So I said a lot of things there, but I want people to hear my heart as a pastor and as hosts, of this podcast. And I think it's totally fine if people use the word gay to describe themselves and their experience, particularly.
That's a relief, because otherwise this could have been a much shorter podcast.
You would have to, we would censor your book. We would just change the title of it. Particularly when, I love your title. It's like, well, okay, single gay Christian, but as you talk about being single, you're like, you just let off. You're like, I am a celibate gay Christian. It's very clear. It's very clear that gay and sex are not the same, right? Like you can't. So, I don't know. I'm off my game, Greg. I just came off a sabbatical. I don't even know how to ask questions anymore. I'm terrible. I'm just like ranting and raving, and then I'm like, oh, I should probably come up with a question for my guests.
I will receive your question as respond in some way to that.
Respond in some way to that rant, please.
I have some thoughts you'll be shocked to hear. One of them is, apropos of the thing you were saying about the people who are like, well, I don't know why you call yourself gay, because like I wouldn't call myself adulterous. And a lot of people who say that, it's like, you wouldn't call yourself adulterous, I hope, unless you are actively adulterous. But you would if you're able to talk openly about your ongoing experience of the world. You would call yourself straight or heterosexual. Interesting. So I wrote a blog once about, I won't say the name of the particular theologian, but it's a much respected theologian who, among other things, participated in the creation of a document that was arguing that people shouldn't use the word gay to describe themselves. And he gave an interview explaining that paper. And in the interview, he called himself heterosexual. And so I wrote a blog about it, and I was like, I love that he's willing to like acknowledge the nature of his attraction over time. He, as a married man, says like, I recognize that there are both aspects of my experience that are good and can be ordered toward honoring God. And also like there are experiences of ongoing sexual temptation as a heterosexual man that I am called to say no to. And I can acknowledge those things. And so I love that he like acknowledges them and then takes the word that is culturally understood to describe those things and uses it to describe himself. And so I said in the blog, like, I just wish that he would give me the dignity of also having the ability to do the same thing with my own experience. It seems to me sometimes when straight people feel uncomfortable with like the equation of like, well, but no, but like being straight isn't inherently sinful, whereas being gay is inherently sinful, even if, and we'll talk momentarily about like not reducing sexual orientation to just the experience of like sexual attraction or sexual temptation. As you said, it's so much more than sex. We'll go there momentarily. But even if you were to accept the premise that we could just reduce our experiences of sexuality to who we are sexually attracted to, sexually tempted toward. My experience as somebody who's exclusively gay means not only that I experience attraction toward the same sex, it also means that I experience absolutely zilch attraction to the opposite sex. It means that you could drop me in a room full of naked women and I would be like, oh, look, my dearly loved sisters in the Lord, right? And feel absolutely no temptation to lust in that moment.
Aren't you all cold? Like, can I get you a blanket or something? Sorry.
I'm here for it.
That was inappropriate. I'm sorry. I can't. I'm just so rusty right now, Greg. Thank you for being my like, what do you call this? Like, it's like preseason. We're trying to get back into the rhythm of doing a podcast again.
It's what a joy to allow you to cut your proverbial eye teeth on me in this way.
That's right. Thank you. Keep going.
So yeah, the notion that for me to not experience that kind of sexual temptation, if you say like, oh yes, like your experience as somebody who experiences, you know, a temptation toward the same sex and not toward the opposite sex, is, you know, inherently deficient to my experience, which is the proper one, which is where I just, you know, am tempted to lust toward, you know, the opposite sex instead of the same sex, and that's clearly superior. I wonder if part of the problem there is not that we have like too low a view of same-sex sexual orientation, but that we have too high a view of straightness. Like if your vision of straightness is like, oh no, like it's such a good and tremendous thing that I experience sexual temptation, you know, toward way more people than the one person that I am married to. And that's just good and normal, and God really wants me to lean into it. Like if that's your vision of heterosexuality, then the problem is that you need a more realistic and a less self-aggrandizing view of your own experience of sexuality. No offense. Well, maybe some offense. You know, if I step down some toes, I hope so.
It's all good, brother. Dude, let me just say, it reminds me, you talk about that reform doctrine, whatever, of if you are what did they say? I don't even remember. Okay, let me just say this. First of all, you just said several things I said in my sermon on Sunday, so I'm proud of myself there. I'm tracking with you. I've got your like stamp of approval. I love it. I am attracted to women. And that is frustrating to me. Okay. Like, let me just say that. Like, I am attracted to many women, and it's not a sin for me that I find, like, I've told someone once, just because I got married, it doesn't make all attractive women unattractive. Like, oh, all of a sudden they're just not attractive anymore. I mean, it is a ridiculous notion to me. Okay, now I got to calm down. I got to be more respectful. Scratch it from the record. I can't say it's a ridiculous notion. I was going to say something else. No, I wasn't. Okay, let me start over. I disagree when someone says that you, as someone who's gay, that your attraction is a sin. You can't control your attraction, because I would be in like blatant sin all the time because I find women attractive, and I get to choose what I do with that attraction, and I get to choose what I do with it. But to say that it's a sin to be attracted to someone, I just think, wow, that is, they have created an extreme double standard for gay people, because that is just, it's so, yeah. And I love what you're saying. I mean, it's like, first of all, there's part of me as you're talking, I'm like, man, I'm kind of jealous if you could get dropped in a room like that and not have any issues at all. Like, gosh, I would love to have that be true of me. Sorry. Oh, I feel like I've been drinking this morning, but it's just that I've been drinking my Angry Brew. Shout out to my sponsor, and I'm talking to you. I think you're bringing it out in me, Greg. So.
Oh, well, what a joy. May that dynamic be further accentuated as we continue to talk. Okay, so can I carry us 2 degrees further?
Yeah.
In that same conversation. So 1 degree further from the like recognizing that every experience of sexuality has, you know, both its capacities for, you know, temptation, its dangers, and also its capacities for good. It's also important to recognize that, again, even if we only reduce sexual orientation to experiences of sexual attraction and temptation specifically, and orientation, we're talking about like broadly over the course of time, here are the experiences of attraction that I suspect I will have when I have them, as opposed to, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word gay specifically, they think like, oh, so like at all times, like at this exact moment, you're experiencing same-sex attraction. And at this exact moment, I am not experiencing same-sex attraction, even though Noah's very handsome, you know, congratulations. but like, to talk about sexual orientation is just to talk about a general pattern over time. If I am going to experience sexual attraction, I know what it will look like. It's not like at every moment, you know, every time I see somebody of the same sex, I think sometimes, especially straight men sometimes freak out about this with gay men. They're like, oh, so you're gay and that means you're attracted to all of us. Like you must be attracted to me. And I think straight men, you just got to get a hold of yourself. So you're not as attractive as you think you are.
That is so funny. Let me just say this though, too, even if that were true, okay, who cares? Like, so if I'm talking to a woman that I find attractive, I can't like talk to her. Like I'm able to process that. I'm able to compartmentalize that as a mature Christian and go, I'm not doing anything with that. It's like, if I'm talking to a guy, I just think, again, there's so many double standards that the church is putting on you, with that same dude who's saying that, and he's talking to some attractive woman in his church. He could feel like some attraction to her, and that's okay. It's not like he's lusting over her, or he better not be. Like, he can choose if he's going to go into the like lust or pursue that attraction. I just think that's so stupid to I don't know. So I love what you're saying, but I also think that's a huge double standard, because you're going to feel attraction to people, and I feel attraction to women, and I just have normal conversations with them. And then sometimes I'll tell an accountability partner about it, like, man, I'm feeling attracted to this person. It's really annoying. Just I'd make sure I'm just letting you know, make sure I don't do anything stupid, like be extra, try to be funny, or try, just like stupid things that I would do. Anyway, dude, keep going. I'm so terrible.
No, this is great. I'm loving all your interjections. Noah, keep them coming. Okay, so then to move us yet further, right? So even if we were just talking about temptation, there are reasons to kind of equate the experience, as we recognize, like, it's more than just specific attraction or temptation. It's also just, we're talking about general patterns. Yeah. And then once we move yet further afield from that and say, there's a whole lot that's involved in what we could call being gay, or being straight for that matter, that isn't just about sex, isn't just about sexual attraction per se.
Yeah.
Like, there are some larger components of that experience. And here's where I think, we get into sort of murky territory. I think we get into some speculative territory. People get into some trouble here. So here's hoping that you and I, Noah, can become among those people who get into trouble.
It's only people's third favorite podcast, so it's fine. It's not like it's fine. We don't have a big drop or anything. So,
perfect. Yeah. So this will be safe space to explore a few ideas.
Okay.
So for instance, think about this. When you're around certain people, and prior to, and maybe even in some ways unrelated from the specific, like, oh wow, this person is attractive, there can also be just like the gut level experience of like the butterflies that you're not quite sure, like, why, like, did I eat an apple that was a little too sour, or like, am I feeling something right now? That deep gut sensation that you're just like, I don't know. I'm currently rereading the Harry Potter series,
yes,
which hopefully is also, super controversial to your audience.
We would have burned those books growing up in, my childhood. But yeah, I'm reading those to my daughter right now. So.
Oh, how fun.
She's obsessed with them.
So I'm in book 5, and hopefully this is not too much of a spoiler for anyone.
Spoiler!
Harry has kind of a thing for Cho Chang in book 5. But a lot of what we see in book 5 is just Harry being super awkward around Cho Chang, which is like multiple degrees removed from like anything. These are teens. The books are very much not explicit. This is not like a sexual or like pre-sexual relationship that Harry has with Cho Chang. This is just like, when he's around her, like, he gets super awkward. And it's so maddening to read as a reader. You're like, come on, Harry, pull it together.
Pull it together, Harry.
But there is a sense in which just the ways we interact with different kinds of people are shaped by things like our experience of our attractions, even when they're unrelated to attraction per se. Right? So like, the ways that I will interact when I'm with the sort of good looking man that I'm like, oh, you're the kind of person that I could be attracted to. Like, I have been socialized in certain kinds of ways. I have had to socialize myself in certain kinds of ways to figure out, like, how do I deal with those interactions? Right, in ways that, like, I could be around like a drop dead gorgeous woman who I think I would know many guys who would sort of automatically, even before they became aware of like, this woman is attractive, they would just, like, they're socialized to be, I don't know, potentially awkward around her. And I'm like super normal, like, she and I can be besties in 3 minutes flat, you know, like, it's not a problem. So there are just ways that our mode of interacting with the world gets informed by our experiences of attraction, but then continues to be true in ways that are completely separate from attraction per se, right? It's kind of like what you were saying about the 7-year-old, like, unless this was a very precocious 7-year-old, and here I mean precocious in the sense of like experiencing sexual attraction well before the typical human average, then this is a 7-year-old whose experience of being gay has everything to do with socialization and nothing at all to do with sexuality. Furthermore, and let me just throw this in as a fun, like, I have no statistical evidence here. This is purely anecdotal, but I meet so many people, so many gay men who play the piano. It's just absurd to me. Like the number of times that I'll meet somebody and they'll be like, I'm a worship leader and I play the piano. And then later they'll be like, and also I'm gay, you know? Or they'll be like, yeah, I'm gay, you know, I'm a musician. And I'll be like, oh, what do you play? And they'll be like, oh, the piano. I can't explain it. And yes, if you know a male worship leader who plays the piano and is mysteriously single, I don't want you to go around thinking that person is gay. I'm just saying.
Our ratings are going to go up after this. We're going to hit Twitter good on this one. Hey, Coles.
Okay. I have a point here. I swear.
I love this.
And the point is as follows: that I can't explain exactly, but it does seem that there's simply something about certain sensibilities of the world that can make people disproportionately likely to pursue or not pursue certain kinds of activities. Right? Why do we have stereotypes about gay men in musicals? Well, it's a stereotype, so it's not entirely true. And yet there does seem to be something broadly true, that certain kinds of experiences of the world, certain sorts of predispositions can lend us to incline in certain directions. And if we recognize that that's true, that we are predispositionally inclined in a variety of directions, then for me to talk about being gay is not simply to talk about experiences of sexual attraction, but it's also to talk about my own particular alchemy of predispositions that causes me to do things like play the piano. And I don't mean to brag, but I'm half decent as a piano player.
Nice.
And would I be as good of a piano player if I were straight? It's a really interesting question that is completely impossible to answer. Like I said, this is where we get into speculative territory and get into trouble. And yet it seems to me that those things are, they're inextricable. Right. Which, for those of you who don't know the word, is a fun way of saying like they're entangled with each other and you can't just easily disentangle them. And so once we talk about sexuality, like we're talking about all of that, even if we think we're only talking about part of it, we're trying to have a conversation about the whole thing.
And that's where a lot of this pain comes in. And I've heard that consistently from gay people that are Christians that are trying to wrestle through this wherever they kind of end up landing. And they're saying what you said with, you know, piano, but just in different, they're giving different examples. My interests, my hobbies, I can't articulate it the way you did or the way they do, but basically they're like, my hobby of this or my interest in this is just as much about me being gay as who I'm attracted to. And so when you as a church are like, it's a sin to be gay, it's like, well, it's a sin to, you know, play the piano or, you know, or whatever, like whatever the hobby is, or maybe it's musicals or, you know, whatever. So yeah, those are the types of things that Christians who I think are still living in like a 1980s and 1990s view of human sexuality need to really get caught up to speed on in a hurry, because back then, I remember just as a kid and as a teenager, at least in my niche of the church, and I think it was pretty predominant, it was just like, yo, you choose this. So don't choose it. It's gross. Don't do it. Don't choose it, like you wouldn't choose to rob a bank. Don't choose this. And therefore, we can condemn you, because you're choosing this. And so there's still people that hold on to that. And I hope conversations like this, can help people at least start to go, oh, that's different than I thought. Yeah, it's helpful when you like actually talk to gay people about what the experience is like, of being gay. And so, yeah, this is good. This is really needed. I'm going to try to be a good podcast host, and I have actually some questions that I need to ask you before, I take up your entire day. Though you are 2 hours behind me, so you're good. I know you've got time more than
the day is young.
The day is young. So, all right, let me ask you this. I am preaching the sermon series, so like I asked my friend, what advice do you have for me as I preach this sermon series? So it's a 4-week series. I realized Mother's Day is would have been like week 4 of the series. I thought, oh man. So we're skipping Mother's Day. We're gonna not talk about sex on Mother's Day. But it'll be 4 of the next 5 weeks. I kicked it off this last Sunday, and I'm planning to take week 3 to just specifically talk about human sexuality, LGBTQ plus, and for you, Greg, and you, the work you do with the Center for Faith, Gender, and Sexuality. Is that what it's called? Did I get all the words in the right order?
Yes, faith, sexuality, and gender. But you had all the right words.
I was close. I was really close. So close. I can't ever remember what RCB stands for either. So it sounds like a microbrew that Grand Rapids would make, so.
We basically, RCB is, for those of you listening, the name of my church here in Boise, Resurrection Covenant Boise. But we're basically a microbrew. If there were a church in Boise that were a microbrew, I like to think we would be close. So, yeah.
I love it. That should be your gift to new people, is like a stein with your logo on it, filled with IPA. So
I'll have a word with the team.
All right. So what advice do you have for me for the sermon? And what I mean is specifically, what would you like to hear? And what do you think? And we didn't get into side A, side B. I've done that before. I think when I interviewed Nate or Wes, I don't remember, and we don't have to get into it here, but let's say particularly if you were an open and affirming gay person listening to this series, what would you like to hear? And feel, I don't know. I always wonder, how much do I need to define this stuff? From let's just say we don't need to define it right now, but if you were a gay Christian and I'm not some steps fine. If you're anybody, you work with a lot of people at Center for Faith. What is it that you want to hear in a series like this from a straight pastor? This is legit. I'm gonna take some notes. So give me some advice.
Well, in that case, I'll send you my consulting fee.
Hey, I've already downloaded your pastoral papers. Those are incredible. So
we've got some good papers. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
So one thing that comes to mind that I think I've been pondering a lot recently, just in how we have conversations about sex, about sexuality, is that I think our habit for a long time, within evangelicalism at any rate, has been to be hyper focused on boundary questions, okay, so which things are allowable, which things are not allowable, where precisely is the line, and I mean, certainly I think that's true in the conversation we have about same-sex sexuality, right? The question of okay, so same-sex sexual relationships, yes, no, maybe so, where are we at? As if that is the most important thing we can give people, is just the right answer. And hear me, I happen to think that the question of where we land on our sexual ethics around same-sex sexual relationships is important. If I did not think it was important, I probably would not be living my life in the way that I'm currently living my life. So I think that's significant. And simultaneously, I also think that a lot of other questions related to sexual ethics are significant. I think that the question of when, if ever, remarriage after divorce is the best course of action for followers of Jesus is important. I happen, and this is a super unpopular opinion among evangelicals, I happen to think that the question of whether or not sex during a woman's menstrual period is advisable for married couples is important. Even though I think many Protestants don't prefer to discuss that one. I'm here for talking more about sex during menstruation. No, okay, that's not exactly true. I'm here for having that be as much a part of our discussion of sexual ethics as anything else. And yet, with all of these topics, I think we do ourselves and our communities, and the folks who are not in our communities but are looking on from the outside, a disservice if we have those conversations in a way that implies that the most important thing we can do is simply arrive at the correct answer. I think we see that particularly to be true when we're thinking about, say, dating couples who are pursuing marriage and are keep asking questions like the how far is too far question, right? And it's like, well, okay, so the line is right here. And I think the discourse of the line, the discourse of this is okay and this is not okay, tends to draw us toward the kind of behavior in which we sort of like do everything we can to get right up to the line, like, well, I heard making out is acceptable, and it's just penetrative sex is not. And so we find ourselves, trying to get right up to the line. It seems to me that the much more fruitful conversation in all of these spaces sometimes has less to do with, okay, where specifically are the lines, which of these behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable, and more broadly to do with the question of what is the posture of heart that we bring toward God as we think about the degree of interest he has in our stewardship of our own bodies and the degree of authority he has to have interest in those things. Because it seems to me that for a lot of us, straight and gay and everything else, there can be a point at which people want to say to God, like, okay, you can make some rules, but then at some point, like, this is going to be my thing. Right? Like, oh, sure, you can make rules about whether or not gay people can get married, but once I marry my spouse, like, you shouldn't have an opinion on that, Jesus, and I think, again, regardless of where we draw lines on these things, I think this is how a lot of Protestants, for instance, will think about something like contraception or non-procreative forms of sex within marriage. Is they'll say like, oh yeah, I just don't want Jesus to have an opinion on that. I think that's part of like, yeah, like Jesus said I had to marry the right kind of person. He says I have to be faithful to my spouse. But now that I'm in my marriage, like Jesus can have no opinions on what me and my spouse do in the bedroom. And again, whether you think deeply through these questions and arrive at the view that there really are no Christian limits within sexual activity within marriage. I hope you don't believe there are no limits. I hope you recognize that things like marital rape are a real problem. I am not the right podcast guest to discuss marital rape, so we're not going to go there today. Although at this point we've already gone there. Good heavens, you would think I'm coming back after a sabbatical too.
We'll make sure Preston doesn't listen to this.
By all means, encourage him to. It seems to me that the attitude of heart that says, I want to give Jesus permission to go this far with me and no farther.
Yeah.
That it seems to me is the more fundamental problem when it comes to our sexuality, and simultaneously a belief in kind of the grossness of our sexuality or the grossness of our bodies that tends to pervade a lot of these conversations. I love the way 1 Corinthians 6 offers its rationale for like care with our sexuality and our bodies. Where Paul says at the end of the chapter, you're not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. And I think I remember when I first learned that verse thinking like, oh yeah, like God's just saying he owns me, like that feels kind of oppressive maybe a little bit, and I felt uncomfortable with that passage. And the more I sat with it and realized like, oh, like you're not your own, you were bought with a price, suggests that there's such great honor accorded to the human body. God is saying like, I'm actually really jazzed about the human body. Like when I created people, male and female in my image, I said like the body itself is an image of who God is. And I think if we believe that reality deeply, then it would give us more cause to be careful in the ways that we think of our bodies as belonging to God. And yeah, I would love for us to see our discussions about sexual stewardship, about sexual ethics, as being motivated less by a disgust for what is bad and motivated more by a delight in that which God calls good. Because it seems to me that that is the logic that 1 Corinthians 6 offers to us, is a logic of saying the reasoning behind a care for sexual stewardship is a reasoning that says God takes such great, passionate, interested delight in the embodiment of the human. And I think if our conversation can be oriented toward that positive vision, we're much better set up, again, to approach those conversations in a way that's not motivated just by drawing a line and saying this is in and this is out, but instead that says, Jesus, because I trust that you actually have such deep, intimate care for my body, I want to make all of my sexual decisions from here on out, not just the line drawing, but the way that I inhabit the spaces I inhabit. I want those to be motivated by an ongoing understanding of the care and the interest that you have in the way that I've been embodied. I feel I'm at risk of rambling, and yet I want to ramble slightly further in saying this, that I think it's really, really incredibly crucial when we talk about sex and sexual embodiment to recognize that it's not as if a marital relationship that has sexual activity within it, that's not just like the yes of sex, and being single and celibate is just the no of sex. That there are no's that still need to be said within marriage. And again, I will largely leave it to you married folks to figure out what the no's are within marriage. I am the wrong person to have that conversation most of the time, though I'm full of opinions. And there are also yeses in the way that we're embodied as single people. Again, not yeses to sexual activity. I do genuinely believe that the call to singleness includes, for followers of Jesus, a call to be sexually abstinent. And yet, that's not simply a waste of a person's sexual embodiment. It's not as if God is sitting up in heaven being like, well, when Coles became single, at that point, I really just wished that I hadn't given him genitals. Like, it really would have been, he should have just been, it's not as if at the point at which we choose celibacy, we choose something that fundamentally denies our sexual embodiment. But instead there is, and I think the Catholic monastic tradition has been far better about leaning into this reality than Protestants, I think largely because Protestants are just scared of celibacy in general. But the reality that there is still an ordering of the self and of the body toward the person of Jesus within celibacy, that there's a unique kind of yes within that. Okay, at this point, with hopes that I have said at least a few scandalous things, I will shut up.
That's great. I love it. I want to close with getting some of your thoughts on singleness. And so just kind of, I'm going to tie a couple things together here. And singleness and community as well, No Longer Strangers, I feel like did a lot. I think both books point a lot towards community. And I think there's there's the myth within the church is that when you get married, then all your needs for community are satisfied. But I also on the same token, want to honor the ache that a lot of single people feel. I was just this week, Facebook friend, acquaintance, online. There's a woman, and she's put her age. I think she's getting close to 30, and just kind of wrote a long, sort of heartfelt post about being single and how it's difficult, and it's a season, and she's trusting that God will basically bring her a husband, at the right time, and she's going to trust God during this season of singleness. And several people commented underneath, other women who are single, and said, yeah, me too. I'm struggling with God with the same thing right now. And, there's a lot wrapped up in that, because there's real, I say that as a real example, like of real ache. And I just wonder what would you say, what's your advice to singles, and particularly to singles who are struggling with that type of ache that they're feeling? Because as I read it, in my heart, I'm like, it may not be a season. It might be, but what if he never comes? What if got that, and then again, that person will come, and you'll have a lot of problems. And sometimes it's worse than when you were, you'll wish you were single again. So I don't know, when you hear that, what comes to mind for you, and maybe in addition, just some general advice you have to singles that are feeling, pretty isolated, whether they're gay or straight. But I think the church does a pretty lousy job in general at providing community to singles, and just ways that you've navigated that.
Yeah, I love that question. A couple things that come to mind. One is, I would just want to acknowledge that, first of all, that I think the ache is there for singleness, but for singles, but it's also felt differently by different kinds of single folks. Right. Like, I recognize that as a man living in the West, I experience singleness very differently than single women experience it. I think while there are lots of similarities between the experience of straight people's singleness and gay people's singleness, I think those are felt differently in some various ways. And so, yeah, the ache looks different for different folks, but I think there's some commonality in it. There we can find some solidarity in it. And within that, I've found it helpful to recognize that the current state of singleness as we experience it right now, before the marriage of Christ and his bride in eternity, it is seasonal for all of us, just more seasonal for some than for others. I mean, marriage, your marriage, Noah, is also seasonal. Hopefully may the Lord grant you and your wife many, many years. But also, like, if we take Jesus seriously, you and your wife are not going to be married in eternity either. You also will join us, join the rest of us single folks in, participating collectively in the marriage between Christ and his church. And if we recognize, like, all of our vocations on this earth are temporary. No matter how permanent we feel our permanent address has become, it is temporary, because this life itself is temporary. And so I would want to encourage folks, I think, to see the temporariness of life as both as a really hopeful truth, and also as a constant uncomfortable reminder to not try to seek a life in which you feel totally settled. Right? To not try to make your current singleness or marriage the thing that you get so comfortable in that you think, oh yeah, like, I need this to be forever. Because the invitation of Jesus to his followers is actually an invitation to a kind of homelessness. I love when a particular disciple comes to Jesus and says, hey, I want to follow you. And Jesus is like, well, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He's basically like, if you want to follow me, like, get ready for a life of placelessness. And I think so many of us are waiting around looking for our place, and feeling like, well, if I don't have it right now, like, I don't have it as a single person, but I'll get married and then I'll have my place. And the reality is, you don't have your place now. And if you get married in this lifetime, you will still not have your place. But Jesus is good in the midst of the placelessness. In Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham and Sarah are praised for their faith, precisely because the author of Hebrews says, they lived in tents, they subsisted on promises. That's more of a paraphrase than what the author actually says. But they anticipated the things coming even though they didn't see them.
Yeah.
And so whether you remain single for your entire life, whether you have a human marriage coming for you, in the end, all of us as followers of Jesus are called to anticipating a promise that will never fully be realized until we get home to eternity. And so in that sense, I hope that our most confident security, as single people who recognize that our singleness is in some sense seasonal, I hope the security we're looking for is not the security of eventually becoming married. But I hope it's the security of knowing that the marriage between Christ and his bride will be so good that it is worth waiting for.
Mm-hmm. Can you practically, how do you live as a single person where you still have community in your life?
Oh, I live entirely impractically. Okay. So this is the thing about community. I think so often we build a vision in our minds of the kind of community we ought to have, or the sort of people with whom we feel like we need to be friends, the way that we think we need to experience. And then we find ourselves discounting the kinds of possibility for community connection that don't fit our model. Like, well, yeah, this person is around and available, but like, they're not really the kind of person I imagined becoming friends with. Or we think like, oh, I want to be hospitable and help create community. And we have this vision of hospitality that's like, and the floors will be perfectly vacuumed and the food will be beautiful and the souffle perfectly risen. Like we have this vision of how life in community is supposed to happen. And then we miss out on the opportunities to actually have life in community because we're so busy trying to achieve this imagined and not actualized vision. Practically, it seems to me that the way to do community is to start doing it before you're ready for it, and to do it with the kind of people who you didn't imagine yourself doing it with. I mentioned earlier, we were talking about my hurdle friends. So lots of my closest friends here in Boise are, as I said, that group is all like 9 years older than me, which is great. I don't hang out with them and think like, wow, I am 9 years younger than these people. I just hang out with them and think like, these are my friends, and I'm friends with like 15-year-olds, and I'm like, these people are great. And I'm friends with like single widowed women in their 80s, and these people are amazing. And if I walked around, as I think so many Westerners do, being like, okay, as a man in my early 30s, I'm gonna need some other single men in my early 30s, and that's gonna have to be my crew. I think the genius of the body of Christ is that it puts us into community with one another in the midst of our difference, in the midst of our imperfection. And it gathers us around the table and says, look, take and eat from the body, not because you've arrived, but because you still need to eat. You still need to drink. So do it in fellowship with one another. Be hospitable in the context of your imperfection, be in relationship with one another, even when you feel like it sucks. Because if you wait for the vision of the community that you think you ought to have, then you'll miss the community that God has placed in your lap.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up there. And I guess, well, I'll ask before I go if there's anything just pressing that you want to share with listeners. I think you're yeah, I'll just toss it back over to you. And if not, no worries. But I think this is just really, really helpful. And I think, again, for those that are wrestling with their own sexuality, for those that are that aren't, and for those who are single, there's so much to glean from your story and your what you've had to wrestle with, and the way that you're leading. So I guess any closing words of encouragement for listeners.
I found it great fun. Sometimes people ask me like a closing word of encouragement. And I'll quote Jesus from, I believe it's the book of John. Woe to you when all people speak well of you. Which doesn't sound terribly like an encouragement to a lot of us. But I think there's something really importantly beautiful about it. And maybe this brings us back to kind of the place at which we began our conversation, making the distinction between being people whose priority is to be perceived as followers of Jesus and being people who actually follow Jesus. There's something both disheartening and simultaneously reassuring and encouraging about the reminder that the actual pursuit of Jesus will lead us into a place where not all people will speak well of us. And part of the gift of finding ourselves in that space and being not always spoken well of is that it's an invitation to us to constantly be reevaluating the question of whether the thing we're pursuing is actually Jesus. And that, it seems to me, is a question that we need to ask ourselves again and again, because we are so well predisposed as human beings to pursuing things that dress like Jesus, and we have come to believe are Jesus, but turn out in the end just to be our idolized vision of him, or just turn out to be our community's perception of whether we are like him. But in Jesus himself, there is something so much more glorious than that. And also so much more ignominious than that.
I don't know what that word means. You got to unpack that.
Ignominious, related to ignominy, poor reputation.
Okay.
Yeah. Bad words spoken about oneself. The invitation into Jesus is an invitation into perhaps even a bit of sketchiness, to use a word that we were using earlier on. And I think there's a great gift of that, not just for folks who are in a vocation like mine, not just for the gay celibates among us, but even for the straight married pastors with a really strong facial hair game like Noah, right? There is also for Noah an invitation to the ignominy of having not all people speak well of you. And the Jesus you find in the midst of that will be far better than the Jesus of the good reputation that you might have thought you needed.
That's good. Thanks, Greg. This has been awesome. Thanks for joining us on the flip side.
Oh, what a delight, Noah. Thanks for having me.
All right.
You ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
All right, welcome back. I'll try to keep our outro short. I know my intro was long and the interview was a little long, and I'm trying. Survey submitters. I'm trying to keep these episodes a little bit shorter, so we'll keep working on that. Again, just a couple things. If you can fill out the survey, that would super help me out. noahfilipiak.com/survey. Also in the show notes. If you can help us get to our goal of 20 patrons to be able to keep the podcast sustainable, you can go to patreon.com/noahfilipiak and score some sweet swag there as well. Be sure to become a subscriber so you can catch up on your 5-minute flips, which is a ton of bonus content, really short, usually 10 to 15 minute episodes that you may have missed. thank you for tuning in. I highly recommend you check out Single Gay Christian and No Longer Strangers. And I will see you next time on The Flip Side.
The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak is a Beyond Ministries production. Copyright Noah Filipiak. www.noahfilipiak.com. Theme music by Kyle Lake at K-Lake Music. Used with permission. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.
It's time to bring me closer. There's no purgatory, cause you're in or you're out. When you see him in the clouds, then you know it's going down. Raise them, raise them, raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money probably long, but short is what your days.